They said everything had a price, even motherhood. When billionaire Khalid Al-Mansour offered a single mother millions to bear his heir, it was supposed to be a transaction, not a transformation. But inside her suitcase wasn't just clothing. It was a secret that could bring down kingdoms. As the walls of his empire start to whisper, one question will haunt him. What if the child wasn't the only thing she was hiding? The scent of oud drifted through the air like a warning as the auction room filled with silent power. Men in tailored suits and traditional dish dashers lined the private estate's gallery, surrounded by marble lions, velvet walls, and a silence that vibrated with secrets. But this wasn't a bidding war for art or yachts, this was something far more unorthodox. Khalid Al-Mansour, the reclusive billionaire oil magnate known for reshaping global markets with a mere phone call, stood before them, not as a buyer of companies or land, but of bloodline. A custom contract, forged in private chambers and drafted by international lawyers, had one clause that dropped jaws across the elite crowd. The surrogate mother he selected would not just carry the child, she would raise it under his terms, inside his guarded estate, until the child reached 18. No marriage. No co-parenting. No romance. Just business. Legacy. Preserved. It wasn't coercion. The mother, whoever she would be, had to agree willingly. And she would be compensated more than any CEO. Still, as the cameras were disabled and security enforced silence with eyes alone, one couldn't help but feel that this auction whispered of something ancient and dangerous, a trade of soul for structure. Enter Amira. She walked in wearing plain clothing, her hijab a soft grey, her eyes unreadable. She had no agency representing her, no glossy resume. Just silence, presence, and the weight of someone who had nothing left to lose. Khalid's eyes met hers, and something stilled in the room. There were whispers. Why her? What did she offer that a million other surrogates didn't? The answer was something Khalid couldn't admit aloud, not even to himself, her defiance. In a world where everyone bowed to his will, she did not flinch. Not when his assistant outlined the living conditions. Not when the contract was laid out on gold-embossed parchment. Her only question had been one that stunned even the lawyers. Can I raise the child with kindness? Khalid had hesitated. But in the end, he signed. So did she. A private jet flew her from Cairo to his secluded island compound that same night. As the plane soared into the clouds, Amira stared out the window, her fingers pressed against her stomach. It wasn't yet showing. But her heart already beat for the child. Not his child. Hers. Meanwhile, in the halls of power, Khalid poured himself a drink and looked out at the stars. Proud, unaware. He had bought the perfect heir. Or so he thought. But across the world, a message was sent in code to a nameless number. 3 words. Phase 1 complete. Amira had a plan. And this was just the beginning. Cairo never apologized for its cruelty. It was a city that loved the rich and tolerated the rest. A place where dreams were traded for survival before the sun had even set. Amira had once believed in the poetry of life, back when her world was filled with her husband's laughter and the giddy hope of new beginnings. But hope had no loyalty. It vanished the day he disappeared, leaving behind only a mountain of debt, a flooded apartment, and a pregnancy that no longer felt like a miracle. She had searched for him, cried for him, even cursed his name in the dead of night, but the only answer was silence. Then came the eviction. Then the betrayal from her own brother, who sold their mother's ring for cigarettes. Then hunger. Her newborn cried through the walls of a shelter that reeked of mold and despair. Every job she took paid less than minimum wage and demanded more than dignity. And so Amira learned. Not how to fight, she didn't have the luxury of rage. She learned how to disappear. How to survive. She mastered silence like a second language. When they underestimated her, she let them. When a manager slapped her backside in a kitchen freezer, she didn't scream. She slipped fish guts into his luxury dish and watched him vomit through an entire dinner service. When a landlord refused to return her deposit, she filed a report under his wife's name that triggered an investigation into his hidden gambling den. She never fought loud. But she never lost. Her son, Sami, grew up knowing 3 truths. Never cry in public, always observe first, and never let anyone see your full hand. Amira taught him chess using bottle caps and street maps. She taught him to read faces the way others read books. By the time he was 5, he was already fluent in Arabic, English, and silence. No one knew about him. Not her neighbors, not her employers, not even the man who once promised her forever. She moved often, paid in cash, and burned every trace of their existence before they left a place. Because once, long ago, someone had threatened to take her son away. And Amira had smiled and said, "Try." So when the offer came, an unmarked envelope slid beneath her door, containing only a name, a number, and a one-line message. "Your child will be safe, if you agree." She didn't call the police. She didn't panic. She cooked dinner like always, tucked Sami in, and then called the number. The voice on the other end gave her a date, a time, and a flight. "Come alone," it said. And she did. But before boarding the plane to Abu Dhabi, Amira took one final precaution. She kissed Sami's forehead, handed him to the only person she trusted in the world, an elderly librarian with no phone, no social ties, and a fierce love for forgotten things, and whispered, "If I don't come back, teach him everything." Then she turned and walked away. In Khalid's compound, she was treated like a fragile possession. Silken robes, gold-plated bathrooms, servants who wouldn't meet her eyes. But she didn't need their kindness. She needed time. Every smile she offered Khalid was calculated. Every conversation was laced with just enough vulnerability to keep him curious. And every night, she prayed in silence, not for strength, but for clarity. Because inside her stomach grew not only a child, but a countdown. She had agreed to the deal not for money, not for survival, but for leverage. For one final play that might free them both. Khalid didn't know that he hadn't just purchased a womb, he had invited a ghost into his house. A ghost with unfinished business. And Amira, wrapped in softness and scars, would haunt his empire one room at a time until the truth made him bleed. The compound was unlike anything Amira had ever seen. Marble corridors wide enough to drive a car through, fountains that whispered secrets, and walls so thick they seemed designed to keep history out. There were no clocks. Time inside Khalid Al-Mansour's estate bent to his will, a luxury afforded to those who answered to no one. Amira arrived with only a duffel bag and a soul split between necessity and resistance. Khalid didn't greet her personally the day she moved in. Instead, she was shown to her suite by a woman with hollow eyes and a voice that spoke only in instructions. The room was beautiful, excessive even, silk bedding, antique cribs imported from Italy, a closet that still smelled of polished wood. But beauty could be a form of imprisonment, and Amira knew better than to be seduced by soft things. She found a hidden camera the first night. Then another behind the mirror. It wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. And still, she played her part. Khalid didn't come to her with questions. He came with monologues. Over dinners curated by Michelin-starred chefs, he would speak of lineage, of legacy, of power measured not in billions but in the bloodlines that carried one's name into history. Amira listened. She nodded in the right places. But inside, she was cataloguing every detail, his vulnerabilities, his blind spots, the way his tone softened when he spoke of his late mother. What struck her most was not his arrogance but his loneliness. Khalid didn't have friends. He had partners, employees, worshippers, people who praised him in his presence and feared him in his absence. But never once, it seemed, had someone challenged him without an angle. Until her. That's why he lingered in her doorway, asking if she needed anything. That's why he watched her read poetry to her unborn child, pretending not to listen. That's why he once asked, barely above a whisper, if she believed in love that had no name. Amira's contract laid everything out in brutal clarity. She would bear the child, she would live in the estate, she would raise the child under Khalid's financial care, but the child would legally be his. If she violated the terms, attempted to flee, contacted outside authorities, or disclosed the arrangement, she would lose custody, and the child would be taken to a secure location, raised as a Mansour, and she would never see them again. She signed knowing all of this. But the clause she focused on most wasn't about punishment. It was about presence. For the first 5 years, Khalid himself would remain largely distant, observing but not participating, as the child's emotional foundation was shaped. It was a loophole. It meant she had 5 years. 5 years to build a bond so unbreakable, no paper, no man, no empire could sever it. One night, Khalid found her outside by the garden, barefoot in the sand, her hands resting on her belly. He didn't speak at first. Just watched. Then he asked a question that sounded like a confession. Do you think a man like me can be a father? The question caught her off guard. Not because of its vulnerability, but because it came from someone who had always seemed more machine than man. She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. Her silence was the answer. And perhaps that's why, for the first time since signing the deal, he looked unsettled. Like maybe he didn't fully understand the contract he'd created. Like maybe he had underestimated not her resolve, but her soul. In the days that followed, the dynamic shifted. Khalid became more present, more curious. He asked about her childhood, her dreams, even her thoughts on literature. He wasn't seeking intimacy, he was trying to solve her, like a riddle carved in flesh. And Amira, ever the tactician, allowed just enough pieces to fall into place. She told him about growing up in a household where women were only spoken to when convenient. She told him how her father once said, "The only time a woman should be loud is when she's giving birth." Khalid laughed at that, not mockingly, but with the quiet horror of someone realizing he might have become the very thing he despised. But he didn't apologize. Men like him didn't. They compensated. The compensation came in the form of gifts, a private library, a music room, a marble tub filled with rose petals from Morocco. Amira accepted them all with grace, but never once said thank you. Not out of rudeness, but to remind him that nothing had changed. She was still there on her own terms. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Khalid began to feel it, that maybe the contract wasn't just flawed. Maybe it was doomed. Because despite all the legal power in his hands, he could not control the one thing he hadn't accounted for. Her humanity. It made her unpredictable. It made her dangerous. And worst of all, it made her unforgettable. There was a moment, sometime during the second trimester, when Khalid began calling her Amira instead of the mother. It happened casually. While discussing the child's potential name, his voice softened and let the word slip like it had always belonged to him. But it hadn't. And when she didn't correct him, it wasn't acceptance. It was calculation. Because Amira had seen the signs, his glances that lingered longer than necessary, the questions that revealed more about his loneliness than her character, and the silence that stretched between them like a string about to snap. Her body grew heavier each day, but it wasn't the weight of the baby that burdened her. It was the awareness that the walls around her were no longer just made of marble and security. They were made of interest, of attention, of something far more dangerous than surveillance. Khalid had begun to care. And caring, in men like him, didn't lead to tenderness. It led to obsession. He began cancelling meetings to sit with her during prenatal sessions. He insisted the doctor fly in from Zurich rather than risk an outsider from the local hospital. He replaced her attendance with a personal midwife who had signed a more aggressive NDA than the estate's architect. To an outsider, it looked like devotion. But Amira knew better. It was control wearing perfume. He needed to feel involved, but not vulnerable. He wanted to touch the edge of fatherhood without letting it cut him. And in doing so, he crossed boundaries with the elegance of a man used to rewriting rules. One night, as she lay sleepless in her room, she found a gift box on her pillow. Inside, a small bracelet engraved with the word beloved. It wasn't labeled for the child. It was for her. That was the first time she allowed herself to feel fear. Not because he desired her, but because desire implied expectation. And she was no longer just a womb to him. She was becoming a threat to the version of himself he thought he had mastered. It was during one of his business trips, a supposed emergency meeting in Geneva, that Amira acted. She had memorized the staff's rotation schedule. She knew which hallway cameras had blind spots, and which guards were more likely to check their phones than their surroundings. She took the journal, her journal, and slipped into the abandoned East Wing, a relic of the estate rarely used since Khalid's father passed. There, hidden behind a loose brick in the wall, she placed the notebook. Not because it was evidence, but because it was the only way she could document the truth if things went wrong. Every page was filled with names, timelines, locations, coded entries that detailed not just her plans, but her son's whereabouts. If she disappeared, someone would eventually find it. Someone who could piece it all together. The journal wasn't protection. It was insurance. But Khalid returned early. He didn't say why. Only that he had a feeling. And when he entered the room that night, he didn't speak. Just stood by the window and stared at her like she'd morphed into someone else while he was gone. "You've changed," he finally said. Amira met his gaze, her face unreadable. "Pregnancy does that." He nodded, but his eyes didn't move from hers. That's when she knew. He had found something. Not the journal. Not yet. But something else. Maybe the burner phone hidden in her mattress. Maybe the tracking chip she'd dislodged from the sole of her slipper. Or maybe, more terrifyingly, her silence had finally spoken too loud. The next day, she was escorted to a new suite. Bigger, grander, but with only one door and a biometric lock. No explanation. No threats. Just a tightening of the noose disguised as luxury. Khalid resumed his charm, but his eyes now flickered with something colder. He asked more questions about her past. Where she grew up, who she spoke to, why she never mentioned family. And Amira, who had once mastered the art of omission, found herself cornered by his precision. That's when she made the mistake. She hesitated when he asked if this was her first child. It was only a second, but he saw it. Like a man watching the stock market crash before the numbers appear. He didn't confront her immediately. He waited. Days passed in a fog of routine, but the air had changed. Then, one evening, she returned from a walk to find him in her room. Not angry. Calm. Almost gentle. He held a small book in his hands, not hers. A children's book. Torn at the spine, pages worn. "It was hidden in your laundry basket," he said. "Why would you bring a child's book unless—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Instead, he asked a question that sounded like a verdict. "What aren't you telling me?" The walls seemed to pulse with the weight of it. Amira felt her heartbeat in her throat. But she didn't answer. Because there were some truths so sharp, they had to be unwrapped with care, or they would cut everyone in the room. The next morning, Khalid didn't show for breakfast. His absence was louder than his presence ever had been. Amira sat at the long, gilded table in silence, chewing on toast that turned to dust in her mouth. Her instinct screamed at her, run, hide, prepare. But she had no place left to go. The compound was sealed tighter than a vault, and every move she made was now under scrutiny. The guards had changed too, not their faces, but their posture. They were closer, more alert, no longer pretending to be invisible. The illusion was gone. Whatever Khalid had uncovered, it had changed the rules of the game. He knew. Or at least, he knew enough to be dangerous. That night, after the estate lights dimmed and the desert wind howled against the stone walls, Amira went to retrieve the journal. It was gone. The brick had been replaced, the hiding place perfectly reset, but her notebook wasn't there. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She returned to her suite, locked the door behind her, and began to pray, not for herself, but for Sami. 3 days passed. No confrontation. No explanation. Then, on the 4th day, Khalid summoned her. The message was simple: come to the East Wing. Alone. When she arrived, she found him not in rage, but in reverence. The room had been transformed into a nursery. Soft lighting, white curtains, hand-painted walls adorned with stars and moons. But in the center of the room wasn't a crib, it was a table. And on that table, laid out like evidence in a trial, was her journal. Next to it, a photograph. A boy. Her boy. The one she'd sworn to protect with every breath in her body. The image was recent. Sami, laughing, standing by a book cart in the back room of a forgotten library in Cairo. Her legs nearly gave out. She clutched the doorframe to stay upright. Khalid didn't look at her. He stared at the photograph as if trying to translate something ancient from a language he'd never known. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. No longer sharp, but frayed. "He looks like me." The sentence shattered everything. Because it wasn't a question. It was a realization. Amira had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 ways, but never like this. She'd planned to confess only if it bought time. She'd prepared lies wrapped in truth. But now, faced with a man who held all the power and none of the understanding, she said the one thing she had never dared to speak aloud. "His, not yours." Khalid turned, his expression unreadable. "But you let me think," she interrupted. "I let you believe I was doing this for the money. That I had nothing to lose. That I was empty." She took a step forward, trembling but unbroken. "But I was full, Khalid. I had everything to lose. My son is the only part of me the world didn't destroy. And I made this deal not to sell myself, but to protect him." He didn't respond. He just stared at her like he was trying to see through skin and bone to something buried deeper. "Protect him from what?" he finally asked. Amira inhaled, slow and steady. "From the people who killed his father. From men who move money through charities and smuggle power through marriages. Men who smile in your face while plotting behind your back. The kind of men you sit next to at gala dinners." That's when the shift happened. Not in her voice, but in his silence. Because Khalid didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He knew exactly who she was talking about. And that's when she understood, he wasn't just wealthy. He was tangled in the very system she was trying to escape. Amira stepped closer to the photo, picked it up with shaking hands, and whispered, "If anything happens to me, they'll come for him next." Khalid looked at her, truly looked at her, and something inside him cracked. Not because he felt guilt, but because for the first time in his life, he saw someone willing to burn for love, not legacy. And it made him question everything he'd built. The empire, the contracts, the illusion of control. He hadn't bought a future. He'd trespassed into someone else's present. He had used gold to open a door he was never meant to enter. As the sun rose behind them, casting its judgment through stained glass, Khalid said the only thing he could say. "He stays with you. No matter what happens." Amira blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. But before she could ask, he turned and walked away. And she was left holding the photo, her belly heavy with life, her heart broken open by a truth she hadn't expected. Sometimes redemption doesn't come from confession. It comes from witnessing someone else's sacrifice and choosing, finally, not to be the villain. The next week unfolded in silence, the kind that feels holy and dangerous all at once. Khalid withdrew into himself, attending no meetings, cancelling public appearances, and allowing his billion-dollar empire to run on autopilot for the first time in decades. The house staff whispered of a shift in the air, something unspoken tightening around the halls like smoke from an invisible fire. Amira moved quietly through the compound, more watched than ever, but somehow more invisible too. Khalid neither summoned her nor avoided her. He existed in a limbo between guilt and awakening, uncertain which would win. She waited, not with fear, but with the patience of someone who knew that the final move in a long game wasn't made in haste, it was made in sacrifice. And she sensed it approaching. The storm broke one night without warning. A convoy of 3 black SUVs arrived at the estate gates just after midnight, unannounced and heavily armed. Not local police. Not Khalid's own security. These were men who moved like phantoms and carried themselves with the entitlement of those who considered themselves above consequences. Amira watched from her window as they entered the main hall, briefcases in hand, escorted directly to Khalid's private office. Within moments, the house changed. Guards doubled. Doorways were locked. She was instructed not to leave her suite. But she'd lived too long in the shadows to obey blindly. She knew this wasn't business, it was blood. And it was about her. Or rather, about the secret her child carried. Inside that office, documents were spread out on the table. Photographs of Sami, surveillance stills of Amira from years prior, grainy footage of the library where her son had once smiled so freely. The men spoke not in threats, but in polite commands, the way powerful men did when they no longer saw you as an equal. Khalid listened, unmoved, as they reminded him of old alliances. Of deals made long ago that kept borders open, contracts flowing, oil protected. They referenced a name, one Khalid recognized instantly. The man responsible for Amira's husband's death. A man deeply connected to Khalid's own father's network. The implication was clear: remove the threat, silence the woman, erase the child's lineage, and everything stays intact. Khalid didn't speak. Not immediately. He looked down at the photograph of Sami, the boy with his mother's eyes and a fire he recognized from somewhere deep within himself. Then, without warning, he stood and walked to the fireplace. One by one, he dropped the documents into the flames. The room erupted in shouting. But Khalid remained calm, almost tranquil. "This boy," he said quietly, "will inherit nothing from your world. He will live. Free. Protected. Even if it costs me everything." And just like that, the deal was broken, not just the contract with Amira, but the far older one, the one built on legacies soaked in oil and silence. The men left. Not defeated, but calculating. Khalid knew this was not the end of them. It was the beginning of a war that would now wear suits instead of uniforms. He returned to Amira's room just before dawn. She stood in the middle of it, as if she'd known he would come. He said nothing, only handed her a small envelope. Inside was a new identity, new papers, a passport for Sami, and a plane ticket. "You'll go tonight," he said. "My name won't follow you. But my protection will." Amira stared at the envelope for a long moment before asking, "And what about the baby?" Khalid placed a hand gently on her belly. "You raise them both. However you see fit. I will not claim what was never mine to own." She left that night, escorted by guards she didn't recognize. New men, chosen by Khalid himself, bound not by fear but loyalty. As the private jet took off, Amira looked down at the glowing lights of the estate below, a kingdom built on wealth and haunted by its own conscience. She held Sami's hand as he slept and placed her other on the life growing inside her, knowing this time, this child would be born not in desperation, but in freedom. And Khalid? He stayed behind. The man who once bought a mother like a property now sat alone in his grand halls, surrounded by everything and owned by nothing. He made no public statement. No media appearance. Just a single act, weeks later, that rippled through the world. He liquidated half his fortune and distributed it across shelters, refugee centers, and women's health foundations, each donation made under Amira's name. He never contacted her again. But somewhere in the hills of Spain, where Amira would one day build a new life under a new sky, her daughter would grow up hearing bedtime stories of a man who had everything and gave it up, not for love, not for redemption, but for the truth. And the truth was this: some debts cannot be repaid with money, only with change.